Chapter 1: The Queen Who Died Unloved. The heat in the lunar palace was oppressive, a suffocating blend of roaring hearth fire and the heavy, musky incense Rowan favored. It clung to the skin, settled in the lungs, and refused to disperse, as though the very walls wished to bear witness to what was unfolding. Once, that scent had meant nights of shared warmth and whispered vows. Now it smelled of rot, of something long dead dressed up as devotion. Blair lay reclined on the velvet chaise by the fire, her body draped in silk that suddenly felt too heavy, too tight. Her breath caught, not in surprise, but in dreadful recognition, as the poison began its work. It was not the violent strike of a blade or the swift mercy of suffocation. No. This was deliberate. Intimate. The toxin seeped through her veins with languid cruelty, a slow, sensual unraveling of flesh and will. It felt as though molten lead had been poured into her marrow, thickening her blood until it dragged through her body like syrup. Each heartbeat grew heavier, slower, more laborious than the last. Rowan did not pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, his shadow falling over her face, blotting out the firelight. His fingers traced the elegant line of her throat, lingering where her pulse fluttered wildly beneath his touch like a bird beating itself bloody against a cage. The familiarity of it was unbearable. This was the same hand that had once cradled her jaw as he kissed her beneath summer stars, the same thumb that had brushed tears from her cheeks when she first told him she was with child. Now that thumb pressed lightly against her windpipe. Not enough to kill, just enough to remind her how easily he could. "You always did have such a delicate neck, Blair," Rowan murmured, his lips grazing the shell of her ear. His voice was velvet soft, affectionate in tone, monstrous in intent. "So easy to break, so easy to adorn with jewels you never truly understood how to wear." He shifted his weight, his thigh pressing between hers, using his body to pin her in place as her strength drained away. In any other context, the intimacy would have promised heat and possession. Now it was a violation, calculated and complete. He wanted her to feel him there, to know that even as life slipped from her grasp, he still owned the space around her. "Does it burn?" he asked, studying her face with detached fascination. "That's South Sea venom. Rare. Expensive. It mimics fever at first. Heat, a lover's touch, turned inside out." Blair tried to answer, tried to curse him, to scream, to call the guards stationed just beyond the gilded doors. Nothing came. Her tongue felt thick, useless, and her lungs refused to fully expand, as though the air itself had grown hostile. A sharp, melodic laugh cut through the haze. Ava stepped forward from the shadows, the silk of her gown whispering across the marble floor like a serpent slithering through grass. She did not stand apart as a witness might. She moved closer, deliberately invading the space between them, sliding her hand into Rowan's free one. Their fingers intertwined over Blair's weakening body, a grotesque symbol of unity forged in blood. "She was always so dramatic, wasn't she?" Ava said lightly, as though discussing a tiresome play. She reached out, her manicured nails grazing Blair's cheek. Not a slap. A caress. The touch was oily, intimate, and revolting. Ava bent closer, her mahogany hair falling like a curtain, shutting out the world beyond the three of them. Creating a private hell. Her gaze drifted downward, lingering on Blair's stomach. Something dark and sharp flashed in her eyes before settling into a knowing smirk. "To think," Ava murmured, "you believed this child would be your shield, that by carrying his seed, you had made yourself untouchable." The pain in Blair's womb flared, sudden and devastating. Not sharp, but deep. Final. A silent scream echoed through her body as she instinctively curled inward, desperate to protect a life already slipping away. Ava leaned closer still, her lips brushing Blair's ear. Blair could smell expensive wine on her breath, and beneath it, the unmistakable scent of Rowan's skin. "I watched you," Ava whispered. "Through keyholes. Through half-open doors. I watched you preen in silk robes, believing you were the center of his world." Her voice softened, dripping with cruelty. "But every time he left your bed, Blair, he came to mine. To wash your scent from his skin. He told me how your touch made his flesh crawl, how your voice sounded like a funeral bell tolling in the dark." The betrayal struck harder than the poison. It hollowed her out, leaving nothing but raw, aching disbelief. Blair forced her gaze upward, meeting Rowan's eyes. There was no anger in them, no remorse. Only satisfaction. She did not beg for her life. That had already been taken. She begged for something far more pitiful, proof that the man she had loved had ever truly existed. Rowan smiled, slowly, deliberately, a predator savoring the moment before the kill. He caught a tear as it slid from the corner of her eye, crushing the moisture between his fingers, as though extinguishing the last evidence of her humanity. "You were a beautiful bridge, Blair," he said gently, his tone soothing, almost kind. But I have reached the other side now. Bridges are meant to be burned. He stood, the sudden absence of his weight making her feel untethered, as though she were floating toward some vast, empty void. He did not look back as he crossed the room to the heavy oak desk. Upon it rested a single object, the king's gold seal. He lifted it with reverence, turning it in the firelight. The seal of power, the proof of succession. The truth settled over Blair with horrifying clarity. Rowan was no longer merely a prince playing dangerous games. He was the last one left. One by one, his cousins had fallen. Some to accidents. Some to illness. Some to blades wielded by hands that would never be named. She remembered them now. Faces blurred by time and grief. Prince Jalen, smiling and confident. Prince Aldrich, cautious and clever. Prince Kalen, reckless to the end. And Ryder, who had watched everything with dark, sober eyes. Ryder, who had never trusted Rowan's charm. Ryder, who had died first at the hunting lodge, poisoned before dawn while the others slept. She understood now. Ryder had not been weak. He had been inconvenient. Ava remained behind as Rowan moved away. She perched on the edge of the chaise with languid grace, leaning over Blair like a vulture inspecting a dying animal. Her fingers moved to Blair's throat, unfastening the sapphire necklace resting there. The clasp clicked open, loud in the hush of the room. "This blue never suited you," Ava whispered, lifting the heavy gem into the firelight. "Far too cold. It needs someone with fire, someone who knows how to keep a king's bed warm." Blair's vision blurred. The world narrowed to flickering light and shadow. The pain in her womb dulled into a distant roar, like waves crashing against a shore she would never reach. She watched as Ava draped the sapphire around her own neck, the jewel resting against her sister's chest. Rowan returned then, standing behind Ava, his hands settling possessively at her waist. He drew her back against him, their bodies fitting together with practiced ease. They looked like a portrait crafted by a cruel artist, young, beautiful, triumphant, and drenched in unseen blood. "The guards will find you in the morning," Rowan said calmly. "A tragedy. The pregnant queen, taken by a sudden heart veil. I shall be the inconsolable widower." His fingers tightened briefly on Ava's hips. "And Ava will be the devoted sister who remains at my side to comfort the crown." Ava turned in his arms, fluid and feline. She tilted her head back, offering her throat. Rowan kissed her deeply, hungrily, without restraint. It was a kiss, meant to be seen, meant to wound. A declaration of conquest performed inches from Blair's dying body. In that moment, Blair understood the final, unbearable truth. Their passion was not born solely of desire for each other. It was fueled by her destruction. They did not merely want the throne, they wanted the pleasure of watching her lose it. The darkness rushed in, cold and absolute. Her heart stuttered, struggled, and gave one final, shuddering beat. But in that last fragile instant of consciousness, Blair did not feel fear. She felt rage. White-hot. Singular. Eternal. "If there is a god of vengeance," she thought, as the world dissolved, "give me the shadows. Give me the prince they discarded. Give me a chance to turn their fire into ice." Blair woke with a scream lodged in her throat, and the phantom taste of bitter almonds coating her tongue. She sucked in air greedily, her lungs burning as if they had forgotten how to expand. Her hands clutched at silk sheets that were too smooth, too cool, and lacked the scent of Rowan's heavy musk. Her heart thundered violently, not with the slow, suffocating drag of poison, but with the terrifying electric strength of a girl who was very much alive. The first thing she noticed was the light. Low lamplight spilled throughout the room, painting the familiar floral carvings of her canopy bed in liquid silver. This was not the dark, incense-choked tomb of the lunar palace, that heavily decorated chamber of her demise. This was the estate of her father, the Viscount of Valerius. She bolted upright, her hand flying to her stomach. Flat, firm, the swell of her pregnancy, and the life that had been extinguished within her, was gone. She stared at her hands in the moonlight. They were slender, unlined by the stress of queenship, and free of the heavy gold rings that had once felt like shackles. A cold realization swept over her. She wasn't in heaven, and she certainly wasn't in hell. She was home. She was 20 years old again, standing on the precipice of a tragedy she finally had the power to prevent. She was back 10 years in the past, granted a decade of stolen time to rewrite the stars. A distant bell tolled across the grounds, low and sonorous. Blair froze. She knew that sound. It was the manor bell signaling the arrival of unexpected, high-ranking guests. Tonight, the memory hit her like a physical blow. The storm. The swollen river. The 5 royal carriages forced to seek shelter at her father's minor estate. This was the night the 5 princes, the nephews of the childless king, had walked into her life. This was the night she had caught Rowan's eye and sealed her fate in blood. Not this time, she whispered, her voice cracking with raw emotion. Blair dressed with shaking hands. She rejected the sapphire blue gown her maid, Martha, tried to press upon her, the color she had once worn to tempt a king. Instead, she chose a gown of heavy, midnight emerald silk. It was a color that made her skin look like ivory, and her blue eyes burn with a cold, predatory light. As she descended the grand staircase, the manor was a hive of frantic activity. Her father, the Viscount, stood in the foyer, pulling at his lapels, his face flushed with the kind of greed that only royal proximity could provoke. Beside him, her stepmother, Eleanor, was whispering to Ava. Ava, her sister, was only 19, a year younger than Blair, but she already moved with a calculated grace. She looked radiant in a gown of pale rose, her mahogany hair pinned up with pearls. She looked so innocent, so soft. Looking at her, Blair felt a surge of nausea. She remembered those same hands unfastening her necklace as she lay dying. "There you are, Blair," her father barked, his eyes scanning her. "You look different. More somber than I expected." "No matter. The princes are in the drawing room. Rowan has already asked who the beauty in the portrait is. Do not fail me tonight." Blair didn't blink. "I have no intention of failing, father." The drawing room was thick with the scent of wet wool, expensive tobacco, and royal arrogance. The 5 cousins were scattered throughout the room, all in their mid to late 20s, each a distinct flavor of danger. There was Jalen, 25, leaning against the piano with a rakish grin that Ava was already gravitating toward. Aldrich and Kaylin, the twins of 24, were boisterously recounting the carriage accident to a group of fluttering maids. Then there was Rowan. He stood by the hearth, 28 years old, his golden hair catching the light, just as it had in the lunar palace. When he saw Blair, his predatory gaze locked onto her. He began to move toward her, that familiar, charming smile playing on his lips, the smile that had been the last thing she saw before she died. Blair's skin crawled. She felt the urge to scream, to claw his eyes out, but she forced her expression into one of icy boredom. Just as he was a few feet away, Blair pivoted on her heel. She walked directly past the future king, ignoring him as if he were a footman, and headed straight for the shadowed corner of the room. Ryder was 27, but he carried himself with the weary stillness of a man twice his age. He wasn't golden like Rowan or loud like the twins. He was dark-haired with dark blue eyes and a dark, brooding energy that seemed to push the rest of the room away. He was tall, his frame leaner than Rowan's but far more dangerous. Beneath his travel-stained tunic, Blair could see the lithe, corded muscles of a fighter. He wasn't a man of the court, he was a man of the blade. In her past life, he had been the sober prince, the one who stayed quiet and died first, a mere footnote. He was currently staring into a goblet of wine, his jaw tight. "The vintage is poor," Blair said, stepping into his space. "I wouldn't recommend finishing it." Ryder's head snapped up. His eyes were like flint, sharp and distrustful. He took in Blair's emerald gown, her calculated distance from Rowan, and the strange intensity in her blue eyes. "And who are you to tell a prince what to drink?" he asked. His voice was a low, rough growl that vibrated in Blair's chest. It was a soldier's voice. "I am the woman whose house you've invaded, Prince," Blair replied, her voice dropping to a provocative whisper. She stepped closer, close enough to smell the rain and the faint scent of cedarwood on him. "And I am the only person in this room who isn't trying to sell you something." Ryder put the goblet down. He looked at her properly now, his gaze raking over her with a bluntness that made her breath hitch. Unlike Rowan's gaze, which felt like a net, Ryder's felt like a challenge. "You're the elder daughter," Ryder noted, his voice slightly rasping. "Rowan has been looking for you. Why are you hiding in the shadows with me?" "Perhaps I prefer the shadows," Blair said, her fingers grazing the silk of her skirt. "They're more honest than the gold leaf in the center of the room." The night progressed with a feverish intensity. The storm outside lashed against the windows, mirroring the turbulence in Blair's heart. She watched as 19-year-old Ava flirted with Jalen, and she felt Rowan's eyes following her every move, his confusion turning into a dark, frustrated hunger. But Blair stayed glued to Ryder. She watched him drink, not out of joy, but out of a grim necessity to dull the world around him. "You drink like a man who expects to be betrayed," she murmured to him as the clock struck midnight. Ryder leaned down, his face inches from hers. The proximity was staggering. He was beautiful in a rugged, unfinished way, his skin tanned from years of travel. "In my family, Lady Blair, betrayal is the only thing we can count on." "Then let's give them something real to talk about," Blair whispered. She knew the layout of the manor better than anyone. She knew which hall led to the guest wing, and which door had a faulty latch. When the wine finally took its toll on Ryder's weary body, she guided him away from the noise, her hand resting on the firm, hot muscle of his forearm. In the guest chamber, the air was thick with the scent of rain. Ryder was intoxicated, his movements heavy, but his eyes never lost that sharp, piercing quality. He backed her against the door, his hands framing her head. "What are you playing at, little Viscountess?" he breathed, his chest heaving against hers. The heat radiating from him was a physical force. Blair looked up at him, her heart racing not with fear, but with a desperate, wild hope. "I'm saving your life, Ryder. Even if you hate me for it." She reached up, her fingers tangling in the dark silk of his hair, and pulled his lips down to hers. The kiss was desperate, tasting of wine and salt. It wasn't the practiced, hollow passion of Rowan, it was a collision. Ryder groaned against her mouth, his hands sliding down to her waist, gripping her with a strength that promised bruises. He hitched her up and carried her to his bed, passion riding high. They didn't even bother to undress. The sharp pain of Ryder's entry reminded Blair she was still a virgin in this timeline. A gasp left her lips from the pain, slowly subsiding to pleasure under Ryder's measured movement. He buried his head in her neck, both lost in the delirium of sensual pleasure. The door suddenly flew open moments later, and her father stood there with a lantern and a gaggle of shocked servants. Blair didn't flinch. She looked at the horror on her father's face, and the dazed, lethal fury in Ryder's dark eyes as he looked between father and daughter, sensing he had fallen into a trap. "Blair! You stupid girl!" her father shouted, more people gathering behind him. Ryder pulled away from her. She could feel his member leaving her body while still hard, and she, still tender, slightly flinched. "It seems, father," Blair said, her voice steady as she smoothed her hair and skirt, "that you and the prince have come to an understanding." Ryder stood up, hot fury radiating from him. One of his cousins, Jalen, clicked his tongue in amusement. "Bad form, cousin," Jalen muttered. Ryder's furious eyes landed on his cousin, making him shrink back. The dawn brought a cold gray light and a hurried ceremony in the manor's small chapel. Ryder stood at the altar like a man facing an executioner. He was sober now, his face a mask of cold, glittering rage. He didn't look at Blair as the priest droned on. He looked at the wall, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When it came time for the rings, he grabbed her hand. His touch was electric, but his grip was iron. He slid the band onto her finger with enough force to make her wince. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed under his breath, so low the priest couldn't hear. "You think you've caught a prize? Your life will be miserable." "I despise a schemer," Blair snorted, which made him look at her in surprise. "How childish and ignorant you are to the world around you," she said, meeting his eye with a blue gaze that was unwavering. As they stepped out of the chapel, the other princes were waiting. Rowan was standing apart from the group, his face a thundercloud of wounded pride and murderous intent. He looked at Blair, and for the first time she saw the monster clearly without the mask of love she had harbored for 10 years. Ava stood by Jalen, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and a strange new jealousy. She had wanted to be the one to cause a stir. She had wanted to be the center of the royal drama. Ryder turned to Blair, his voice cutting through the morning mist like a blade. "The horses are ready. We leave for the king's hunt immediately." He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear in a gesture that looked intimate to the onlookers but felt like a threat to Blair. "If you're going to be my wife, Lady Blair, try to stay out of the way. I don't have time to babysit you." Blair watched him stride toward his horse, his movements fluid and powerful, the lithe body of a fighter coiled and ready for the slaughter to come. "I'm not planning on being a burden, you idiot," she whispered to the wind. "I'm planning to save you." The hunt was beginning, and this time, Blair held the map. To her surprise, Ava joined her in her carriage. Her stepmother, Eleanor, came to the window. "Ava is to come with you. Since you have managed to snag yourself a prince, it's only fair you help your sister. Jalen or Rowan will do just fine. Since one of them will be king, but you decided to shack up with the least important one, let your sister take up the task of elevating our family status." Eleanor delivered it with a cool tone and walked away. The sleek, black steed Ryder was riding came to the window next. His eyes landed on her with a chilling coolness. "Are you ready, wife?" "Yes," Blair answered, sitting back and closing her eyes, blocking out the young viper sitting opposite her with childish excitement. Chapter 3. The King's Preserve. Dawn bled slowly into the forest like a wound that refused to close. Mist clung to the low ground, silver and thick, coiling around the hooves of horses and the boots of men as the hunting party gathered at the edge of the king's summer preserve. The air was biting, smelling of damp earth, crushed pine needles, and the iron tang of wet stone. Horns sounded in the distance, low, mournful, and ceremonial, but beneath the pageantry, Blair felt the old dread tighten around her ribs like a corset cinched too tight. She adjusted the heavy furs around her shoulders, her breath blooming in small white clouds. Beside her in the carriage, Ava was still asleep, her head lolling against the velvet padding. They had arrived at the king's hunting lodge in the dead of night, a chaotic blur of torchlight and hushed whispers. The sleeping arrangements had been the first battle of the transition. This suite was supposed to be Ryder's, a room overlooking a frost-dusted courtyard, but he had stepped aside the moment they crossed the threshold. "The lady and her sister will take the chamber," he had told the lodge master, his voice a gravelly rasp of exhaustion. "I will find a pallet in the guards' quarters." Blair looked at Ava's peaceful face. Her sister's presence here was a wild card, a variable Blair hadn't accounted for in her previous life. In the timeline that was, Ava had been safely tucked away at their father's estate, far from the rot of the court. Now, she was a target, Blair resolved then. She would find Ava another room today. Ryder was the heir to a legacy of blood, but he was also her husband by law, and her shield by necessity. He did not need to give up his comfort, nor did she want him out of her sight. If he was in the guards' quarters, he was vulnerable. If he was with her, she could watch the door, because today was the day Ryder was supposed to die. In the history Blair remembered, his death hadn't been a grand affair. It wasn't a dramatic clash of blades beneath the canopy of ancient oaks. It was efficient. Quiet. A cup raised in laughter. A swallow taken in trust. A body discovered too late, eyes already glassy, the poison having done its work while the others slept off their wine. The gathering, after a breakfast she couldn't taste, Blair stood by the mounting block, adjusting her gloves with a deliberate, freezing calm. Ryder was already there, checking his horse's tack. He had not offered her his arm when she came down the stairs. He had not asked if she was warm in the morning chill. He had barely acknowledged her presence at all since their hurried, desperate departure from the chapel. But he had waited for her. He had presented her to the aging king, a man whose eyes were filmed with cataracts, and whose mind seemed to wander toward ghosts, as his new wife. He had done so without scorn, standing tall and silent as the king's blessing fell over them like dust. That, she decided, was something. "You should remain with the ladies today," Ryder said at last. His voice was all iron and restraint, clipped as though he were counting the seconds until he could be away from her. He tightened the girth on his saddle, testing the leather with hands that bore faint, jagged scars. "This is no place for a viscount's daughter. The brush is thick, and the dogs are restless." Blair lifted her chin, the silk of her scarf brushing against her jaw. "I am your wife." The words still tasted strange on her tongue. Dangerous. They felt like a title she hadn't earned but intended to weaponize. Ryder's jaw flexed. He stopped his work and looked at her, his dark eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. "That is a technicality imposed by circumstance, Blair. Don't mistake a ring for a leash." She stepped closer, moving into his personal space until she could smell the cedar and leather that clung to his coat. She lowered her voice so only he could hear, the sound muffled by the snorting of nearby horses. "And circumstances have a way of becoming fatal if you ignore them, my lord. I might just be the only person who wants you alive in this whole sordid place. I can be your eyes at the back of your head." Ryder turned fully then, his movements slow and predatory. "Speak plainly. I have little patience for riddles before a hunt." Blair met his gaze without flinching. She saw the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the weariness of a man who had been looking over his shoulder for 20 years. "Someone intends to kill you today, husband," she whispered. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression. It wasn't the wide-eyed shock of a commoner. It was recognition, a grim, "Ah, finally," sort of look. "You're not subtle," he said coolly, though he didn't pull away. "I'm not wrong. You are playing for a kingdom, and your reclusive, solitary nature makes you a weak and easy target. You think your silence is a shield. It's a target." Ryder exhaled slowly, a long plume of white vapor. He seemed to be weighing her words, looking for the lie. "Every prince here has enemies. My cousins, the ministers, the very men who carry my banners. You'll need to be more specific if you want me to be impressed." Blair leaned closer, her lips nearly brushing his ear. To anyone watching from the lodge windows, Rowan, Jalen, or the king himself, it would look like a newlywed bride whispering nervous pleas or sweet nothings to a distant husband. In truth, her words were a blade wrapped in silk. "Do not drink anything you did not pour yourself," she murmured, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Do not accept food after dusk, and when the hunt breaks at noon, you will claim a headache and leave the clearing. I've already arranged for a servant to move Ava's things. She will have her own quarters by sundown. You spend your nights with me from now on. If you don't, you will be dead by morning." Ryder straightened sharply, his hand closing around her wrist. His grip was not painful, but it was firm, commanding her full attention. His pulse was steady, unnervingly so. "Who told you this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. Blair smiled faintly, a ghost of a look that didn't reach her eyes. A ghost. He searched her face, his eyes darting across her features as if trying to read a map in a language he didn't speak. He was weighing the cost of indulging her apparent madness versus ignoring his own survival instinct. Whatever he saw in the depths of her dark eyes unsettled him more than the threat itself. He released her. "Fine, you will stay near me," he said at last. "If this is some attempt at manipulation, some play for favor, you'll kill me?" Blair finished calmly. "Perhaps, maybe, but not today. Today, I'm the only thing between you and a shallow grave." The hunt surged forward in a flurry of baying hounds and thundering hooves. The forest swallowed them, the sunlight breaking through the canopy in jagged shards of gold. Blair kept her mount close to Ryder's, her eyes scanning the tree line with practiced vigilance. She wasn't looking for a stag. She was looking for a glint of steel, a stray arrow, or a lingering servant. She saw Rowan often. He rode like a man with something to prove, his golden hair catching the light, looking every bit the hero of a story he was currently writing in blood. His gaze was dark and restless whenever it landed on Blair, a mixture of hunger and resentment. Once, as the path narrowed through a thicket of birch trees, Rowan rode close enough that she could hear his voice over the rhythmic beat of the horses. "Quite the spectacle you've made of yourself, Blair," he said lightly, his tone conversational, as though they were in a ballroom. "Marrying Ryder. I'm afraid you will find him to be quite boring. No excitement, no fire, just a man waiting for a crown that will never fit." Blair didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the path ahead. "I've always preferred substance over shine, Rowan. Gold is soft. Iron holds an edge." Rowan laughed, a sharp, barking sound that lacked any real humor. "Careful. You sound disappointed already. Is the marital bed as cold as his reputation?" "I am disappointed," she replied, finally turning her head to give him a look of icy disdain. "In your manners, one would think a prince could afford a bit of grace." She felt Ryder's attention sharpen beside her. He hadn't said a word, but his posture had shifted. His shoulders squaring. Rowan noticed the movement and pulled his horse back a fraction. "How touching," Rowan murmured, his eyes flashing. "Already playing the loyal wife. Tell me, Ryder, does she whisper warnings in your sleep, or just lies?" His horse surged ahead before Blair could answer. Ryder watched him go, something dark and thoughtful settling behind his eyes. "History," Ryder said quietly, his voice almost lost to the wind, "is full of men like him." "And graves," Blair replied. The clearing. By midday, the hunt broke at a designated clearing beside a slow-moving, peat-stained stream. It was a scene of artificial beauty. Silver goblets gleamed on linen cloths, and servants moved with practiced grace, offering platters of roasted game and honeyed fruits. Blair's pulse quickened. This was the moment. In her memory, this was where the poison was introduced, a gift from a cousin to celebrate a successful kill. She watched a servant approach Ryder with a heavy silver goblet, the wine dark as bull's blood. Ryder reached for it, then paused. He glanced at Blair. Just once. A silent question. Blair shook her head, a movement so slight it was barely perceptible. Ryder set the cup down untouched on a nearby trestle table. Without a word, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a simple leather wine flask. Jalen, leaning against a tree nearby, raised a dark brow. "Too good for the king's cellar, cousin? Or have you finally developed a palate for something better than trail water?" Ryder shrugged, unscrewing the cap. "The ride's unsettled my stomach. I'll stick to my own supply." Blair hid her relief behind a sip of water, her hand trembling only slightly. Across the clearing, she saw Ava watching them. Her sister's smile was too sharp, her eyes darting between Ryder and Rowan with a predatory interest that made Blair's skin crawl. Earlier, Blair had confirmed with a servant that Ava's trunks had been moved to a smaller private room in the east wing. Ava had been strangely annoyed by the change, complaining of the draft, but Blair didn't care. She needed the barrier. She needed to know who was behind her door. The afternoon passed in a blur of tension. Every time Ryder adjusted his seat or reached for his bow, Blair expected a hunting accident. But the hours ticked by, the sun dipping low and painting the forest in hues of bruised purple and orange. As they rode back toward the lodge in the deepening gloom, Ryder finally spoke. "You owe me an explanation," he said, his voice low. Blair's mouth curved into a tired, genuine smile. "So do you." His gaze flicked toward her, sharp and searching. "For what?" "For surviving," she replied softly. "It's a difficult habit to maintain in this family." The lodge loomed ahead, its windows glowing with orange lamplight, promising warmth that Blair knew was an illusion. Somewhere within those walls, a plan was unraveling. Someone was realizing that the cup had gone undrunk, that the accident hadn't happened. As they dismounted in the courtyard, Ryder caught her arm, pulling her close into the shadow of his horse. His voice was a low, dangerous, intimate vibration. "You are either the most reckless woman I've ever met," he said, his hand lingering on her velvet sleeve, "or the most dangerous thing in these woods." Blair met his eyes, her expression calm despite the hammering of her heart. "I've already died once, my prince. Recklessness no longer frightens me. And as for danger? You haven't seen anything yet." Inside the lodge, Rowan stood near the great hearth, a goblet in his hand. Ava was at his side, whispering something that made him smirk. Their eyes followed Blair and Ryder as they entered together, a united front that hadn't existed yesterday. The game had begun in earnest, and for the first time, the outcome was no longer written in blood. Blair felt it with chilling certainty. This time, Ryder would live. And this time, the throne would not belong to the man who thought he had already won. The night after the hunt arrived heavy with unspoken things. Blair felt it before she understood it. The way the air itself seemed to tighten around her whenever Ryder entered a room, the way silence stretched and bent between them like a drawn bowstring. Survival had forced proximity. Proximity had bred awareness. And awareness, she was discovering, was far more dangerous than fear. They were no longer merely allies bound by circumstance. They were becoming something else. A symbiotic pair of shadows in a house of light, moving in a synchronized rhythm that neither had expected when they stood at the altar. Ryder stood at the narrow window of their temporary apartments in the eastern wing of the lodge, his back to her, shoulders stripped of their armor but still rigid with restraint. He had removed his heavy hunting leathers and his sword belt, but the muscle memory of violence lingered in the way he carried himself, coiled and ready for a threat that never truly went away. Moonlight outlined him in silver and shadow, tracing the powerful slope of his back beneath a simple linen shirt that did little to hide the tension in his frame. "You were right," he said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet of the room like a blade. Blair, seated at the small writing desk, looked up. The single candle on the desk flickered, casting her shadow long and distorted against the stone wall. "About which part?" He turned then, slowly, his movements deliberate. His dark eyes found her at once, unflinching and intense. "About all of it. The wine, the timing, the intent. You didn't just guess, Blair. You knew." There was no accusation in his voice now, no anger, only something sharp and searching, as if he were trying to see through the layers of the woman sitting before him. "They were going to poison me," he continued, walking toward the center of the room. "Not at the clearing. Tonight," the wine steward confessed, after I had him searched. "A concentrated extract of nightshade, meant to be slipped into the evening carafe. He was paid in coin minted from Rowan's personal treasury, delivered by a man with no name and a face that won't be remembered." Blair closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a breath she felt she had been holding for a lifetime. A knot she hadn't realized was lodged in her chest loosened, leaving a cold, hollow ache in its place. The timeline had shifted. The poison was supposed to be at midday, but the malice remained constant. Rowan was adapting to her interference. "And now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. Ryder's mouth curved into a humorless smile. "Now the steward is in the cellar, and someone else is very nervous. They are wondering why the bells haven't tolled for a dead prince. They are wondering why the lodge remains silent." She rose, moving toward him without thinking. The floorboards were cold beneath her slippers, a stark contrast to the heat she could feel radiating from him as she drew near. "Rowan," she said softly. Ryder watched her carefully, his gaze tracking her movement with the focus of a predator. "You speak his name as if it tastes bitter. Most women in the capital speak it as if it were honey. They swoon at his feet and beg for a glance." "It does taste bitter. Like copper and rot," she said, stopping just a few feet from him. "I have no desire for honey that hides a sting." Silence fell between them again, but it was no longer empty. It thrummed with a low-frequency energy that made the hair on her arms stand up. Ryder stepped closer, closing the gap until she could smell that familiar mix of leather, cedar, and the salt of a long day's ride. "You saved my life," he said quietly. Blair lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "I told you I would. I don't make promises I intend to break, Ryder. My life is tied to yours now, whether you like the knot or not. And yet," he went on, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in her chest, "I don't believe you did it for love of me, or fear of a widow's weeds. You look at me with eyes that have seen the end of the world and survived it. Why, Blair? Why me?" Blair's pulse skidded. She had prepared for many questions. Questions of politics, of lineage, of the borders. This one was raw and personal. The truth was a heavy thing, a physical weight in her throat. "Because," she said slowly, choosing the only truth that mattered, "you were never meant to die first. The world is a darker place without the sun, Ryder. And in the version of the world I fear, you are the only light left worth fighting for." Something dark and unreadable moved through Ryder's expression. He reached out, his fingers hovering near her shoulder before drawing back, as if afraid he might break her, or she might break him. And the others? He asked. The twins? Rowan? Jalen? You speak of them as if they are already ghosts. Blair hesitated. The past pressed close, whispering names of the dead. Some of them, she said carefully, will not survive each other. They are wolves. If they cannot find a deer to tear apart, they will turn on their own pack. I am simply trying to ensure you aren't the one they feast on. Ryder studied her, a strange light in his eyes, then gave a low, quiet laugh, a sound of genuine surprise. You speak as though you've seen it already, as though you've stood over the graves and read the epitaphs. Her lips curved faintly. I have a very vivid imagination, or a terrible memory, he countered, his eyes searching hers, their gazes locked. The attraction between them was no longer theoretical. It was a physical presence in the room, as tangible as the stone walls. It was there in the way Ryder's eyes followed the movement of her throat, in the way Blair's breath shortened when his hand finally made contact, brushing her arm. You should sleep, he said, though his voice was thick with the desire he was trying to bury under the weight of his duty. So should you. Neither moved. The air between them felt electric. Ryder stepped closer again, until there was no longer any polite distance left. He lifted a hand, hesitated, then brushed his knuckles lightly along her jaw, testing the reality of her skin. Blair did not pull away. She leaned into the touch, a small, shaky breath escaping her lips. You should be afraid of me, he murmured. I am not gentle. I was raised for the vanguard, not for the ballroom. I didn't handle you well the last time, our wedding night. I had no idea you were still a maiden. I assumed, given your confidence, I had assumed. I was a brute. She looked up at him, her eyes luminous. I was married to Rowan, she said softly, the words slipping out before she could catch them. That stopped him. His hand stilled. What do you mean? He asked sharply. Blair bit her lower lip. Would you believe me if I told you I've lived this life before? That in the first life, I chose the Golden Prince and realized too late he was made of lead? A muscle in his jaw tightened. Then you know nothing of gentleness, he said, his voice laced with a quiet, simmering fury. And I will not be compared to him, nor will I have my shoddy love-making the first time be the standard by which you judge me. I wasn't, Blair said softly, reaching out to touch his clenched hand. I was explaining why I am not afraid. I have seen the worst of men, Ryder. You are not that. She paused. Wait, you believe me? You didn't call me mad. Ryder's expression shifted to one of weary recognition. Of course I believe you. How can I not? When I woke up from my own death the morning before I rode to your father's manor, I felt the cold iron in my ribs, Blair. I felt the darkness. And then, I felt the sun on my face in the saddle. What? Blair whispered, her knees going weak. She wasn't the only one who had returned. Something broke then. Not restraint, but the final barrier of mistrust. They were two ghosts inhabiting living bodies. Ryder leaned down, close enough that their foreheads nearly touched. If you stay this close to me, he warned, I will forget that I am meant to hate this marriage. Blair's lips parted. If you move away, she replied, I will regret it. For one suspended moment, they hovered on the edge of something irrevocable. Then Ryder took her lips, a desperate, hungry reclamation. They moved toward the bed, the world outside the room ceasing to exist. There was no Rowan, no throne, no poison. There was only the heat of skin and a passion that burned away the chill of their shared memories. Consuming each other with unrestrained desire, they finally became man and wife in truth. Across the lodge, in a chamber thick with the scent of jasmine, Ava laughed. She stood before Rowan, her reflection fractured in the gilt mirror, as she loosened the silk ribbon at her throat. She had watched her sister play the martyr all day, and she had found it tedious. You're restless, Rowan, she observed lightly. Is it because your prize slipped through your fingers? Or because Ryder is still breathing? Rowan sat in a high-backed chair, a goblet of dark wine in his hand. Blair was always a means to an end, he said coolly. A pretty face to secure a border. You, however, are a complication I didn't anticipate. Ava smiled, stepping between his knees. I've always been good at those. You should be thanking me. If Blair had become yours, she would have softened you. I will keep you hungry. Rowan's hand closed around her wrist, his grip tight. And you? Would you never soften me? Ava leaned down, her lips brushing his ear. No, she whispered. I would sharpen you, until you could cut the world in half. His grip tightened, his eyes flashing with a predatory light. Their affair did not begin with romance. It began with shared resentment, and the intoxicating thrill of mutual ambition. You will be king, she murmured against his mouth. Not that brooding statue, Ryder. You and I, we will burn the old world down. Rowan kissed her then, a hard, claiming gesture. Ava welcomed it, her thoughts already racing. Let Blair play at being clever, she thought. Let her hide in the shadow of her substance. I have always preferred the fire. The next few days passed in a slow, dangerous dance. Ryder and Blair grew more attuned to each other with every passing hour. They argued strategy in quiet corners, mapping out alliances. Their bodies were constantly drawn together, a hand brushing the small of a back. A low-voiced exchange that made the rest of the room fade. You're thinking too far ahead, Ryder said one evening as they studied a map. We need proof of the nightshade before we move against Rowan. The king won't execute his favorite nephew on the word of a frightened steward. I know, Blair replied. And we'll get it, not from Rowan. He's too careful. Ryder glanced at her. How? She met his gaze. Ava. She's ambitious, but she's young. She thinks she's playing Rowan, but he's using her as a shield. She will slip. Ryder's expression hardened. You're certain your own sister would betray us? She already has, Blair said softly. She always chooses proximity to power, and she always underestimates the strength of restraint. Ryder's mouth curved faintly. Then she'll find no mercy in me when the time comes. The passion between them simmered just beneath the surface. One night, as thunder rolled outside, Blair found Ryder in the armory. He was alone, running a whetstone over his blade. You're restless, she said. He didn't look up. So are you. You haven't slept more than 4 hours a night. She approached. Rowan and Ava are meeting in the western tower tonight. They think the storm will hide them. Ryder stilled. How do you know? I followed her. I've learned to walk softly, Ryder. His brow furrowed. That was reckless. If Rowan had caught you. Yes, she agreed. But effective. They are planning to move when we return to the capital. Their eyes locked. Ryder set the sword aside. If we survive this, he said quietly, things will change. I won't be a prince in hiding anymore. And you won't be a bride in a cage. Blair's heart kicked hard. For better or worse, for truth, he said. And I find I want that more than safety. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. For you, he echoed. Outside, the storm broke fully, rain lashing against the stone. In the western tower, Rowan and Ava sealed their alliance. But in the armory, Blair and Ryder stood in the light. The board was set. The players revealed. The fire was lit, and it would soon consume them all. Morning arrived without ceremony, draped in the bruised purples and grays of a winter dawn. There were no bells to announce the shift in the world's axis, no grand proclamations from the heralds, and, most importantly, no blood staining the stone floors of the hunting lodge. Just light, cold, pale, and persistent, filtering through the narrow stone windows, bringing with it the quiet realization that they had survived another night in a timeline that was supposed to have claimed them both. Blair woke first. It wasn't the jagged startle of a nightmare that pulled her from sleep, but a honed, sharp instinct. She lay perfectly still, the heavy furs of the bed pressed against her skin, listening to the rhythm of Ryder's breathing. It was slow, steady, and grounded, the sound of a man who was no longer fighting for air in the dark. In her first life, waking had always been an act of dread. Whether it was the golden sunlight of Rowan's chambers or the cold damp of her father's manor, there had always been something jagged waiting for her at the edge of consciousness. Betrayal, a new manipulation, or a subtle cruelty disguised as courtly affection. Here, in the dim light of the eastern wing, there was only silence, and in that silence, a profound sense of safety. It wasn't because the world had suddenly become a kind place. She knew better than anyone that the wolves were still circling, but because the man beside her was a fortress. She studied him. His face in sleep was a map of a different person. Without the watchful intensity of his dark eyes, he looked younger, the harsh lines of his aristocratic features softened by the absence of control. The scar at his brow, a jagged reminder of a border skirmish, seemed less like a brand and more like a history. Ryder the Prince was a masterpiece of iron and discipline, forged in the fires of a kingdom that didn't know how to love him. But Ryder the man, the one who breathed softly against the crook of her neck, was still becoming. And Blair realized, with a quiet, steady certainty that vibrated in her marrow, that she wanted to protect that becoming as fiercely as he protected her life. He stirred then, though he didn't open his eyes. His hand, large and calloused from years of gripping a hilt, moved instinctively across the sheets until it found her waist. He pulled her slightly closer, an anchoring gesture that spoke of a deep-seated need he would likely never admit to while awake. You're awake, he murmured, his voice gravelly with sleep. Yes, good, he said softly, his thumb tracing a small circle over the velvet of her shift. I was hoping it wasn't a dream. I've had enough dreams of the dark to last a lifetime. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze as his eyes finally opened. Which part did you fear was a dream? The part where I'm not alone in this, he confessed. "The part where the wife I was forced to marry is the only person in this wretched kingdom who truly sees me." They rose together without the usual frantic urgency of the court. There was no awkwardness in their shared space, no uncertainty about where one ended and the other began. Their movements already carried the ease of a long-standing familiarity. Not the frantic heat of lovers drunk on novelty, but the weight of partners who had already died for one another and decided that living was a better alternative. By midday, the stagnant air of the hunting lodge was broken by the arrival of a rider from the capital. The first crack in Rowan's foundation had appeared, and it was far more devastating than a physical blow. Prince Alaric's accounts had been opened. In the previous timeline, Alaric, the youngest of the cousins, and a man of immense quiet greed, had been the primary financier of the coup. He had died in a hunting accident staged by Rowan to consolidate power. This time, however, Blair and Ryder had planted the seeds of an audit weeks in advance through a disgruntled clerk she knew from her past life. Merchants from the southern docks testified. Ledgers appeared that shouldn't have existed. Land deeds surfaced, showing Alaric had been selling crown timber to foreign interests. Letters, penned in his distinct, sprawling hand, were read aloud in the high council chambers. Blair watched the messenger's face as he delivered the report to Ryder. The man was trembling. It wasn't fear of the king's wrath. It was the raw, naked fear of exposure. The court was realizing that the old rules of shadows and whispers were no longer protecting them. "That wasn't how he was meant to fall," Ryder said quietly once the messenger had been dismissed and the heavy oak doors were closed. He leaned against the map table, his fingers tracing the borders of the northern provinces. Alaric had lost all his powerful friends in a single afternoon. Only his twin brother, Kaelin, remained as a potential ally, but even that bond was fraying under the weight of the scandal. Blair shook her head, her gaze fixed on the flickering hearth. No. In the world that was, he was meant to die on a muddy road with no witnesses, his throat cut by a man Rowan paid in Alaric's own gold. Ryder's mouth tightened, a flash of phantom pain crossing his eyes. Rowan's work. He always preferred the permanent silence of the grave. Yes, but not this time. For the first time since their rebirth, they were not simply undoing a death. They were preventing one. And Blair was discovering that preventing a murder was far more taxing than surviving one. It required a level of surgical precision that left her exhausted. Prince Alaric was stripped of his titles by sunset. There was no execution, no dramatic climb to the gallows, no exile to a frozen wasteland. He was simply removed. His power was evaporated, his influence turned to ash. He became a living ghost within the palace walls, a man no one would speak to, a man whose signature was now worthless. Rowan did not react publicly. He was too seasoned a player for that, maintaining his mask of the grieving, concerned cousin. But the cracks were there for those who knew where to look. He didn't want to show the world that his carefully curated deck of cards was being dismantled by a woman he had once considered a mere ornament. Ava, however, did not have Rowan's discipline. Blair saw it across the dining hall that evening, the way her sister's slender fingers tightened on her morning fan until the wood creaked. Her eyes, usually so bright with calculated charm, flicked toward Rowan again and again, seeking a reassurance that he was too preoccupied to give. Ava had hitched her wagon to a star she thought was rising, only to find the sky falling. Later that night, Ryder and Blair met in the private map room. There were no guards at the door, no servants pouring wine, just the scent of old parchment and the flickering light of 3 stout candles. "He's losing control," Ryder said, his voice low. "Not control," Blair corrected, moving a silver weight across a diagram of the capital's defenses. "Certainty. In my first life, Rowan always believed the throne was an inevitability. It was written in the stars, in his blood, in the way people looked at him. That belief made him fearless. But now he's doubting, and a man who doubts his destiny is a man who begins to see enemies in every shadow." Ryder nodded, his gaze following her hand. "Fearful men rush. Controlled men wait. If he rushes, he'll make a mistake we can actually use to arrest him for treason." Blair moved a second piece on the board, her eyes cold. "Then we make him rush. We take Kaelin next." Prince Kaelin fell without a single drop of blood being spilled. It was a masterpiece of isolation. His allies withdrew their support quietly, one by one, after anonymous tips reached their ears regarding Kaelin's involvement in Alaric's scandals. His funding disappeared as his creditors suddenly demanded immediate repayment. His name stopped being spoken in the council, not out of hatred, but out of the sheer irrelevance that Blair had engineered. Within weeks, Kaelin was a non-entity. He was alive, breathing, and perfectly healthy, yet he was utterly powerless. Rowan eventually confronted Ryder in the western corridor, away from the prying eyes of the lesser nobles. Blair wasn't present for the exchange, but the echoes of it reached her through the palace grapevine, and the look on Ryder's face when he returned. "You're turning them into corpses that still breathe," Rowan had snarled, his voice thick with the terror of realizing he was next on the list. Ryder's answer had been devastating in its simplicity. I'm giving them the mercy you never could, Rowan. I'm letting them live to see the world they tried to ruin. Rowan had laughed, but the sound was thin, like glass cracking under pressure. As Rowan's power waned, Ava's desperation began to rot into a visible panic. It was a pathetic sight to behold. The sister who had previously ignored Blair, or treated her like a dull-witted obstacle, now followed her through the corridors like a shadow. She watched Blair in the common chambers, measuring her sister's newfound confidence in the reflection of every mirror they passed. You think you've won, Ava hissed one evening when they found themselves briefly alone in the conservatory. The scent of damp earth and dying lilies hung heavy in the air. Blair looked at her sister, truly looked at her, seeing past the silk and the paint. She didn't see a villain, or a grand seductress. She saw a girl who had mistaken the heat of desire for the weight of destiny. A girl who had bet everything on a man who didn't even know how to love himself. No, Ava, Blair said gently, and the pity in her voice was the sharpest blade she had ever used. I don't think I've won. I think I've survived. There's a difference. Ava's eyes burned with a frantic, misplaced rage. You always take what I want. You became a princess. Your existence makes people whisper that I'm a bastard, that my mother betrayed her friend and climbed into bed with her best friend's husband and sired me, and now you're taking the court. Blair shook her head. No. I take what you wanted to destroy. I haven't taken anything that was yours, Ava. Nothing. You had the chance to be my sister, to be an ally. You chose to be a vulture. Don't be surprised when the feast is taken away. That night, Ava went to Rowan. She didn't go as a lover seeking comfort, but as a liability seeking a lifeline. You're losing. People no longer whisper your name as successor. They are all looking to Ryder, she told him, her voice trembling. They're dismantling you piece by piece, Rowan. They know things they shouldn't know. They are ahead of us at every turn. Rowan studied her, and for the first time, he saw her clearly. He saw the fear where ambition had once been, and he despised it. To Rowan, fear was a contagion. He looked at Ava not with passion, but with the cold calculation of a man deciding which cargo to throw overboard to save a sinking ship. Meanwhile, the space between Blair and Ryder grew quieter. It wasn't the silence of distance or the coldness of a dying fire. It was something much deeper. They stopped touching constantly in public to prove their bond to the court. They stopped the performative displays of affection. Their connection settled into something far more dangerous to their enemies: trust. He began asking for her counsel before acting on military matters. She began waiting for his restraint before leaking a devastating piece of information. They were no longer two people playing a game. They were a single entity. In the old world, Ryder said one night, sitting by the fire as the first snow of the season began to fall outside, I would have ordered their arrest the moment the first ledger appeared. I would have had them in the dungeon by dawn. Blair looked up from her book. And I would have done nothing. Too scared to step on anyone's foot. Ryder smiled faintly, a genuine, warm expression that reached his eyes. We're tempering each other, aren't we? Your fire and my iron. Yes, she said. That's what makes us hard to defeat. They are fighting individuals. We are fighting as a whole. Their affection changed too. It wasn't about the grand, sweeping declarations of a bard's song. It was in the presence. It was in his hand finding hers in the silence of a long carriage ride. It was the shared glances, across a crowded ballroom, that said I see you, and I am here. One evening, Ryder watched her as she read by the hearth. The light played across the ivory of her skin and the dark velvet of her gown. You carry the future like a burden, Blair, he said quietly. She looked up, her eyes reflecting the flames. And you carry it like a duty. Is there a difference? He crossed the room and did something he had never done. He knelt before her chair and took her hands in his. Let me carry it with you, not as your protector, but as your equal. I don't want to just survive the future. I want to build one with you. Blair's eyes softened, a lump forming in her throat. For the first time in 2 lives, she whispered, I believe someone actually means that. The end of the beginning came during a full council session. Rowan's mask finally slipped. It wasn't a roar of rage, but a jagged burst of impatience. He interrupted the king during a decree on trade. He openly questioned the judgments of the High Chancellor. He challenged the very foundations of the laws he hoped to one day inherit. The court went silent. It was the kind of silence that precedes an execution. The king looked at Rowan, truly looked at him, his cloudy eyes sharp, and in that moment, the royal eyes saw not a beloved nephew or a capable heir, but a burgeoning threat. A predator who was tired of waiting for the prey to die of old age. Ava, standing in the gallery, saw the look on the king's face. She understood instantly. She had chosen the wrong man. That night, Ava began to pack. She wasn't preparing to flee the city. She was preparing to reposition herself. She was getting ready to betray Rowan before he could use her as a scapegoat for his failures. She was a survivor, after all, and survivors knew when to switch sides. But Blair was already 10 steps ahead of her sister's treachery. "Your sister will move tonight," Ryder said as they stood on their private balcony, overlooking the darkened capital. "I know," Blair replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "She always does when she senses the wind changing. She'll come to us tomorrow with proof of Rowan's crimes, hoping to buy her way back into our good graces." "And Rowan?" Blair looked toward the palace towers, where a single light burned in Rowan's window. "He is a cornered animal now. He will try to burn everything down before he lets us have it." Ryder took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Then we'll be the ones who stop the fire." She leaned into him, not for protection but for partnership. Below them, the royal city moved in ignorance of the war being fought in the shadows. Above them, the crown waited, cold and indifferent. And between them, two reborn souls continued to rewrite fate, not with blood, not with ancient prophecy, and not with the destiny their enemies clung to. They did it with the most powerful force of all: choice. Chapter 6. Ash and Crown. The night Rowan chose to burn the world began quietly. Too quietly. Blair felt it before any messenger arrived, before any bell rang, or any guard raised an alarm. It settled into her bones like a sudden drop in temperature, a pressure change that had nothing to do with weather, and everything to do with a man who had finally decided that if he could not rule, then no one would. She stood at the window of their apartments as dusk bled into night, watching the capital glow with 1,000 scattered lights. Somewhere below, laughter drifted from taverns. Somewhere else, prayers were whispered. None of them knew how close they were to disaster. Ryder came up behind her without sound. "You feel it too," he said quietly. Yes, they no longer needed to explain themselves to one another. Their souls had been forged into a single, sharpened edge. The architect of ruin, Rowan, struck before dawn, not with a blade, but with the systematic destruction of Blair's character. By sunrise, 3 sealed accusations had been delivered to the king. Charges of treason, adultery, and conspiracy leveled not at Ryder, but at Blair. Forgery, Blair realized instantly. It was brilliant in its audacity. Letters bearing her seal accused Ryder of plotting to usurp the throne. Fabricated witness statements claimed she had bribed council members with funds stolen from the northern granaries. A falsified confession, allegedly from the imprisoned wine steward, implicated her as the architect behind the attempted poisoning of the king. Rowan had flipped the board. He had not targeted the prince's strength. He had targeted the prince's heart. "They'll try to isolate you," Ryder said as they read the charges together in the dim light of the map room, his voice deadly calm. "Paint you as the spider at the center of the web. If I defend you too fiercely, it looks like I am under your spell. If I stay silent, I lose you." Blair folded the parchment carefully, her hands steady. "He wants to fracture us. He thinks if he can turn the king against me, he can force you into a corner where you have to choose between the crown and my life." "He is a fool," Ryder stated, his hand finding the hilt of his sword. "He is a desperate man," Blair corrected. "And a desperate man is a predictable one. He thinks I am the Blair of the first life, a girl who would weep and plead for mercy. He doesn't realize I've already seen the end of this story." The Council of Shadows. By mid-morning, the High Council was in session. Blair did not wait for a summons. She walked in under her own authority, flanked by Ryder and a small, elite guard. She was dressed in deep iron-blue velvet, her hair braided with silver thread like a crown of thorns. The king sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of weary disappointment. Rowan stood to his right, looking every bit the grieving, dutiful nephew. "Lady Blair," the king sighed, "the evidence against you is substantial." Blair did not look at the king. She looked directly at Rowan. "Evidence is easily manufactured, Your Majesty. Truth, however, is much heavier." She signaled to Jalen, the head of the palace guard and a man Ryder had spent months cultivating as a loyal ally. Jalen stepped forward, carrying a heavy, iron-bound chest. "This chest contains the ledgers of Prince Alaric," Blair stated. "But more importantly, it contains the correspondence between Prince Rowan and the mercenaries currently gathering at the Eastern Gate. He didn't just want to frame me, he prepared a coup in case the framing failed." Rowan's face didn't twitch. "Lies. Jalen is your creature, Blair. Everyone knows you've been whispering in his ear for weeks. Is that so?" Blair turned to Jalen. "Commander, tell the king what you found in the prince's private study an hour ago." Jalen stepped toward the king, reaching for a scroll in his tunic. "Your Majesty, I found." He never finished the sentence. With a speed born of pure, jagged panic, Rowan drew a concealed dagger. Before Ryder could move, before Blair could scream, Rowan lunged. The blade found the gap in Jalen's armor, sinking deep into his throat. The room erupted. Guards drew steel. The king stood, knocking over his chalice. Jalen collapsed, his life's blood staining the ancient stone floor. "Traitor!" Rowan screamed, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You were all supposed to be on my side." In that moment, the mask was gone. The perfect heir was revealed as a fractured, violent animal. He didn't wait for judgment. He vaulted over the council table, slashing at a guard, and disappeared through the hidden passage behind the king's throne. A passage only the royal family was supposed to know. The capital aflame. Rowan did not flee the city. He fled to his power base. By midnight, the sky over the capital was no longer black. It was a bruised, angry orange. Mercenaries Rowan had paid with Alaric's stolen gold poured into the outer districts. The eastern gate had been thrown open from the inside. Fires bloomed along the trade routes, consuming the warehouses of the merchants who had testified against Alaric. Ryder stood on the palace balcony, his armor gleaming in the firelight. "He's making his stand," Ryder said, his voice a low growl. "He's making his end," Blair replied. They rode out together. Blair refused to stay behind the palace walls. She knew the layout of the city better than Rowan did. She remembered which alleys led to dead ends and which rooftops provided the best vantage for archers. The chaos was absolute. The screams of the dying mingled with the roar of the flames. Blair directed the loyalist forces with a surgical precision, using her knowledge of the past to preempt Rowan's ambushes. "The bridge!" she shouted to Ryder over the din. "He'll try to collapse the south bridge to trap the king's reinforcements." Ryder spurred his horse, reaching the bridge just as Rowan's men were setting the pitch. The combat was brutal, a messy, visceral struggle in the mud and ash. The sisters' final gamble. As the sun began to peek through the smoke of the dying fires, Blair found herself near the old cathedral. The doors were splintered. Inside, she found Ava. Ava was not fighting. She was packing. She had a bag filled with jewelry and coin, her eyes darting toward the side exit. "Leaving so soon, sister?" Blair asked, her voice cold. Ava jumped, dropping a string of pearls. "Blair!" "Thank the gods. Rowan has gone mad. He killed Jalen. He tried to kill me? I was just trying to save what I could for us." "For us?" Blair laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "You spent your life trying to bury me. Even now, you're looking for a way to climb over my corpse to safety." "I can help you," Ava pleaded, stepping forward. "I have proof that Rowan killed our father." "I have the letters." "Our father died of a heart attack, Ava. You know that. You're just inventing crimes now to save your own skin." A shadow fell across the cathedral entrance. Rowan stepped inside. He was covered in soot and blood, his blonde hair matted, his sword notched and dull. He looked at Ava, then at Blair. "The sisters," he hissed. "The ornaments that thought they were players." "Rowan, wait!" Ava cried, holding out her hands. "I was just telling her. I was staying loyal to you. I was misled." Rowan didn't even hesitate. He was past the point of strategy. He was in the realm of pure, scorched earth spite. He swung his blade in a wide, desperate arc. Ava didn't even have time to scream. The steel caught her across the chest, and she fell back into the piles of stolen gold, her blood mixing with the pearls. Blair watched her sister die. There was no joy in it, only a profound, weary sense of closure. The vulture had finally been consumed by the fire she helped light. "The final choice, now," Rowan panted, turning to Blair. "Just you. The woman who broke time." "I didn't break it, Rowan," Blair said, drawing her own small dagger, though she knew she was no match for him. "I fixed it." Ryder burst through the shattered doors then, his cape torn, his face a mask of righteous fury. He didn't say a word. He engaged Rowan with a ferocity that pushed the pretender back into the altar. The fight was not elegant. It was the sound of iron meeting iron, the grunt of dying men, the smell of ozone and burnt wood. Rowan fought with the strength of a man who knew he was already dead. Ryder fought with the strength of a man who had something to live for. Ryder disarmed him with a brutal strike to the wrist. Rowan fell to his knees, his back against the cold stone of the altar. "Finish it," Rowan spat, blood bubbling at his lips. "Send me to the dark you came from." Ryder looked at Blair. He held the sword steady, but he waited. "No," Blair said, stepping forward. "Death is too kind for you, Rowan. You wanted to be remembered as a legend. Instead, you will be remembered as the man who burned his own legacy because he couldn't hold it." She looked at the king, who had entered with the remaining guards. The king looked at the body of Jalen, the body of Ava, and the ruins of his city. "Exile," the king commanded, his voice trembling with age and anger. "Take him to the northern wastes. Strip him of his name. Let him live in the cold, knowing that the world he tried to destroy is flourishing without him." Rowan screamed, a high, thin sound of pure ego breaking. As they dragged him away, he looked at Blair one last time. He saw a queen. He saw a survivor. And he saw a woman who no longer feared him. The morning after, the coronation was held a month later. The city was still rebuilding, but the atmosphere was different. There were no whispers of destiny or blood right. There was only the quiet, steady work of people who had chosen to stay. When the crown was placed on Ryder's head, he reached out and took Blair's hand. He didn't wait for her to kneel. He pulled her up to stand beside him. "You carry the future," he whispered to her, loud enough only for her to hear. "We carry it," she corrected. That night, they stood on the private balcony of the palace. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and the first hint of spring. "Ava is gone," Blair said softly, looking out at the stars. "Rowan is a ghost in the snow. Jalen is buried with honor." "Is it enough?" Ryder wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. "It is a beginning, Blair. For the first time in 2 lives, the page is blank. We get to write the rest." Blair leaned her head back, closing her eyes. She thought of the golden sunlight of the first life, the sunlight that had felt like a cage. Then she felt the solid, warm reality of the man holding her. "Yes," she whispered. "This time, we live." The crown sat on the table inside, cold and indifferent. But between them, there was a heat that no fire could quench. They had moved beyond the script of fate. They were no longer victims of time. They were its masters. By choice. I hope